check that everybody can hear clearly what I'm saying?
Very good. Yes, very clear.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Let's hope it stays like that. Well, the story of David and Goliath, of course, I'm sure is familiar to everyone. The small boy with his sling and stones versus the mighty fighter. And what I'm going to talk about today is how a small and relatively unknown, politically insignificant figure of Cicero, still early in his career at Rome, wins over not just one, but two giants. So our protagonists then, David is Cicero, still, as I said, early in his career at Rome, and of course he's going to rise to the highest position in the state of the consulship, and to remain in demand throughout the highs and lows of his career due to his oratorical skills. On the other side, we've got not just one, but two Goliaths. First, Gaius Verres, a huge figure really in the Roman aristocratic elite, a crony of the dictator Sulla, who turned a blind eye, let's note, to Verres' extortion and other abuses in the Eastern Empire. And later, Verres, 73-1, becomes governor over the important grain-producing province of Sicily, where Verres would run riot, despoiling temples and extorting money and artworks. And that's what the trial is effectively about. Verres' defense barrister is our other Goliath, Quintus Hortensius Hortalus, who was very much admired by Cicero. Cicero comments on that in his rhetorical works. And of course, Hortensius was an incredibly influential orator. He dominated the courts at the time. So both Verres and Hortensius were the Goliaths against whom Cicero had to fight. So what I'm going to think about is why and how, first of all, they come into conflict. The case against Verres, and those who've had a chance to look at the text or can remember it from A-level will recall, it's all about provincial mismanagement. Cicero is taking on complaints from the Sicilians that Verres had extorted money and property as governor of the province. So it's an extortion trial. It's worth noting that that is a very common charge. Public life then as now was often racked by corruption scandals, whether it was buying votes or rigging elections. There was always some corruption afoot. And this, of course, included mismanaging Rome's provinces. I mean, some background here may be helpful for understanding the narrative of how Rome was beginning to stop turning a blind eye to unscrupulous magistrates around its empire. It had already been acknowledged in the 2nd century BC by Gaius Gracchus in the establishment of extortion courts under predominantly equestrian control, that Rome had to undertake or had to develop a certain accountability towards the provinces, that perhaps magistrates couldn't just do as they liked and sustain an empire on that footing. And also there was a developing sense of accountability perhaps of the senators of the aristocratic elite to other ranks of Roman society. And Gaius Gracchus's extortion courts address both of those forms of accountability by giving the provincials some form of redress for abuses carried out by Roman magistrates, members of the Roman upper class. And at the same time, because the juries were equestrian, so ranked down from the senators, the aristocrats were being held to account by their so-called inferiors back at Rome. So there's sort of two quite important, different but complementary forms of accountability in play there. Having said that, when Sulla is in power in the 80s, he carries out various reforms which mean that the courts get taken back over or taken under control by the senatorial elite, which is in a sense pretty obviously a jeopardizing or sort of compromise of justice, because these magistrates going out to the provinces are now going to be tried by their mates. Effectively, they're going to be tried by their peers, by people who may be just as guilty as they were of fleecing the provinces. So the point at which we're coming to this, we're on senatorial juries for these courts, and this is going to be quite important in Cicero's arguments and the way in which he makes his arguments. The problem was, of course, that the charges that Verres faced, extorting money, goods, and so on from Sicily and elsewhere, were probably crimes that most of the senatorial jury had also committed, or many of them, or at least would have sympathy for. And so the challenge for Cicero is how to make Verres seem not like the jury, to isolate him and make him sound uniquely terrible so that the jury can convict him in spite of his very high profile and his very powerful lawyer, without making themselves seem guilty as well. So what Cicero needs to do here is to create a distance between Verres and people very like Verres who are putting him on trial, so that that jury will feel able to convict him. Well, our evidence for this showdown between Verres and Cicero is effectively what we tend to call the Variance. We know a great deal about this trial because of Cicero's publication of his entire side of the case. The Variance then are effectively a series of forensic speeches that formed the prosecution of Verres by Cicero for provincial mismanagement. And I've put there on the screen just a rundown of how the so-called Variance map out. There's first of all the Divinatio in Caecilium, the preliminary hearing delivered in January 70, which gives Cicero the right to prosecute Verres. Only the first hearing, the In Verrem 1, delivered in August of that year, 70, actually took place. The so-called Actio Prima. And at that point, after that, Verres heads off into exile and is deemed guilty in absentia. But what we then have is all the other hearing material, which would have formed the so-called Actio Secunda, the second hearing, which is repackaged by Cicero into 5 speeches and published. And that's the so-called In Verrem 2, which breaks down into those 5 parts. Firstly, about Verres' youth and public career, then 2 sections, well, the following 4 sections all on Sicily really, but different aspects of Verres' crimes there, the abuse of judicial power, the extortion of taxes, the robbery of artworks, and finally, in the 5th section, Verres as magistrate with imperium, responsible for public safety and given the power to punish. Worth just noting then the importance here, given there's only the first Actio was actually delivered, the importance of publication for Cicero in cementing and publicizing his reputation. So even though he doesn't deliver any of those those parts of the second hearing, nevertheless, through publishing the speeches or publishing the material he'd gathered, he's able to absolutely maximize his gain out of this trial. And it's a habit which one might think particularly useful at the early stage of his career. We'll think in a moment about that aspect. But it's also, of course, worth remembering that later speeches were clearly also published. That's how we have them. And a very obvious example of that would be the speeches given by Cicero in his consular year of 63 against Catiline, where the Catilinarian speeches are published not at the time, but a few years after the event in 60, where at a point where Cicero is perhaps a little bit struggling in his career, and the publication of those speeches, possibly edited, it's hard to know what the relationship is between delivered and published speeches, but the idea that this is a good moment to remind everybody of what he achieved in his consulship, how he supposedly saved the state from the dangerous Catiline, and so on. So this habit of delivering speeches, or perhaps not even delivering them, but then publishing them at an opportune moment, is just part of Cicero's strategy for maximizing the benefit of his rhetorical skill. and getting the benefit not once but twice, as it were. The Variance, as some of us were mentioning just before we started with the paper, the Variance constitutes a massive publication. I think must be, if not one of, then probably the biggest published sort of set of speeches that we have. And as if you had a look at the small section that I suggested as possible preparatory reading, if you had a look at that, I mean, even that small fraction of one section of the second hearing is still really a chunky section of text. There's a lot of it. And so, you know, that's just one little bit of the fifth part of the second Variance. So you can see what an enormous volume of material it was. And Cicero's strategy seems to have been fairly clearly to kind of drown the jury in detail and to drown later readers in this vast array of evidence and arguments that he could put together to counter this Goliath. And it's a strategy which seems to have been quite important in persuading Verres to go into exile. The sheer volume of evidence that Cicero was able to stack up against him, provided by the Sicilians. And as we'll see, that volume of evidence that he says he had, of course, he doesn't show you what it is, but he claims to have rooms full of evidence, is matched by the enormous volume of arguments also that he puts to the court. Okay. Well, it's worth thinking, if we're sort of gathering together forms of background, worth thinking about the rhetorical context in which Cicero has to operate before we think about what he actually said. The importance of personalities and reputations, I think, is worth stressing here. The idea that every time a lawyer stood up in the courtroom, he was putting himself and his expertise and his concern for justice and also his wider views about the state and the laws and the world at large, all up for scrutiny. And anybody familiar with Cicero's oratory will know how wide-ranging his frame of references in some of these speeches, that he takes every opportunity, regardless of what the nuts and bolts of the case may be, to remind us of what he stands for, who he is, what his views on legality and the res publica are. And therefore, every successful case is another boost to his personal standing, and every success makes the next one more likely. Performances in the law courts then were opportunities to advertise one's credentials to the electorate at large. And of course, you know, this is where the legal career and the political career come into very close contact and indeed overlap. We might say that that's entirely different from our own legal system, in which we tend to claim that cases have to stand or fall on hard evidence rather than on personalities. Although I think even now it's certainly does no harm to have a leading QC at one side. In other words, the clout of the auctoritas of one's advocates makes a difference to the likelihood of conviction or acquittal. It's also a very uneven contest that Cicero's entering here. I've already noted that Cicero is effectively David to the Goliath of not just Verres, but also his barrister Hortensius. Quintus Hortensius Hortalus, the leading barrister of his day. And it's appropriate that a barrister who stands for the old established Roman aristocracy should be defending Verres, because it's precisely the privileges and abuses of this class that are at the heart of Verres' trial. Hortensius lines up against Cicero. Cicero, who takes the highest office of the consulship in 63, but still in 70, when the Variance are delivered, is building up his public profile and trying to make a name for himself. And here Cicero's early education is crucial. It's important to remember that his ambitious father had clearly bought the best education that he could find. And the title education, education, education is no mistake here. to quote a previous prime minister. The idea that the education is what gives Cicero his advantage. And Cicero and his brother studied with the top teachers of the day, Crassus, Scaevola, and so on. They were sent off to Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean to sit at the feet of the great orators and philosophers. And it's the education which provides Cicero with the means to speak with learning and authority, and also incidentally introduces Cicero to the very high-powered circles of the Roman elite. They're all sitting in the classroom together, as it were. It's that education and those early contacts which allow him to overcome his so-called new man status, his lack of family connections in the political sphere. And it's also perhaps just worth noting the very great importance of early appearances in public life and in the courts for Cicero's courts particularly. Cicero's first appearances in the Roman law courts are critical to his career, and he takes on very risky and high-profile cases. In 80 BC, he'd defended Roscius, who was on trial for parricide, against Chrysogonus, who was one of the dictator Sulla's henchmen. So it's a very, very dangerous trial for Cicero to take on as a complete unknown in the courts. And in a sense, it's the same with Verres, or similar with Verres. He's taking on a huge case here in which he would have to defend his corner, really, in order to defeat the top lawyer of the day, and to convince a senatorial jury to convict one of their own number for a crime of which many of them were probably equally guilty. It's a very tall order. So very risky strategy, all win or all lose, basically. If Cicero had lost the pro Roscio, we'd probably never have heard of him again. And it's worth noting that actually after that case, that's when he disappears off to the Greek East. So possibly he is keeping out of the way a little bit. But then he returns to take on another enormous contender, that is Verres. And that's the case we've got here. Again, the preamble conversation noted that I think somebody had read the Variance for A-level. Actually, my A-level set text was the pro Roscio. So I have sort of slightly mixed memories of that speech and having to know too much about it, really. But in any case, part of the same pattern of risky, high-profile cases to win a name for Cicero and get him started. Okay, well, the section we're focusing on today, and which I suggested might be worth looking at in advance if anybody had time, is about Verres' irresponsible conduct while he's governor of Sicily. It's not about grabbing money in this case, although that is a common theme in the speeches. But the case in point here is the fact that he sent a disreputable and incompetent friend, Cleomenes, off to deal with a group of pirates, while he, Verres, took the opportunity to have a fling with Cleomenes' wife. So it's a nice example of how Cicero is, in these speeches, building up a picture of Verres who is disreputable, immoral, and cruel. The dispatch of Cleomenes to deal with pirates, again, might benefit from a little bit of background. Pirates were clearly a perennial problem in the Mediterranean at this time. And Pompey's Special Command of 67 was set up to deal specifically with the Mediterranean piracy problem once and for all. It was really seen as part of Rome's proper management of the Mediterranean Empire. So in a sense, dealing with pirates sits alongside the extortion courts and so on. It's about Rome beginning to take responsibility in a more settled way for how it's actually going to manage and run and be responsible for the empire, which it's been quite successful in acquiring. And as Cicero asks in the passage I've given you there, are Cleomenes and Verres actually themselves any better than the pirates? He talks about Verres as partner of the pirates. So collapsing the distinction there, I suppose, between the people that Cleomenes is sent up by Verres to deal with and those pirates themselves, they're sort of all collapsed in. Cleomenes, this man whom Verres, the friend of Verres, who's sent out to deal with the pirates, is clearly not, and there's the question mark, the ideal commander. He's presented by Cicero as hardly the ideal person to send out on an expedition of this kind. He doesn't look after his crew, he's morally dissolute, he's a disgrace to his office as the position that he holds and has been given. And it's all part of Cicero's attempt to show how irresponsible Verres is in appointing him. So in a sense, Cleomenes is not in himself particularly interesting for Cicero, but he is insofar as he demonstrates by his own incapacity the irresponsibility of Verres in selecting such a person to deal with this pirate problem. And okay, remember that this is simply for Verres a ploy to get Cleomenes out of the way so that Verres can have a nice time with Cleomenes' wife. So it's set in that frame, and that's the point about Cleomenes really, rather than any intrinsic interest in that figure. But as it says at 2587, all of a sudden, while Cleomenes was drunk and all his crews famishing, they hear about the pirate fleet in the harbour. Completely irresponsible, drunken and dissolute, and neglecting his crew. It's also worth noting that Cicero, throughout this section of the Variance, uses fairly xenophobic arguments to suggest that it is in any case an outrage to send a Syracusan man, Cleomenes, out in charge of sailors to deal with a Roman problem, essentially, that they should be sending a Roman commander out for that and not some Sicilian. So another point against Verres. When the pirate fleet is spotted, Cleomenes boards the fastest ship of his fleet and the one with the most complete crew and takes off for Helorus, vanishing from sight before any of the other 6 ships can even get underway. The others follow on, but the ships are lost and a huge disaster ensues. As the passage outlines, I'm not going to read out every passage in full, but that gives you a little sense of how badly this episode goes due to Cleomenes' irresponsibility and his self-interest. As soon as there's trouble, as soon as the pirate ship's spotted, he just gets on the quickest ship and heads off, and really has no thought whatsoever for the rest of his fleet. And the result of that is, as the passage goes on to say at the end, owing to the avarice and worthlessness of Verres, who'd put this bloke in charge, as soon as evening came on, he ordered a most beautiful fleet belonging to the Roman people, having been driven onto shore and abandoned, to be set fire to and burned. That's the pirate order. So a rather emotive image there of the Roman fleet being destroyed by pirates. This is really heady stuff at this period, in which, as I say, we're not far off Pompey being sent out to deal with the pirates once and for all. So in 70, Cicero inflaming his jury really by reference to pirates burning Roman ships. Again, a way of turning them against Verres. Cicero is clearly outraged by the pirates who rampage through Syracuse on Verres' watch. The rhetoric of the passage I've given you there makes that pretty clear. A miserable and bitter spectacle, that the glory of the city and the name of the Roman people should be a laughing stock, that in the face of all that body of inhabitants and all that multitude of people, a pirate in a piratical galley should celebrate a triumph in the harbour of Syracuse over a fleet of the Roman people, while the oars of the pirates were actually besprinkling the eyes of that most worthless and cowardly praetor, Verres, of course. So complete disgrace in Cicero's presentation here, that we've got a triumph which should always be a Roman triumph, instead a pirate triumph, sort of flaunting its way around the harbour at Syracuse and splashing the crowd. No sense of respect for Rome's reputation. And as we'll see later, Cicero, part of his rhetoric in these speeches is to set himself up as the protector of Rome's dignity, that he's the one who's mindful of and watchful over Rome's reputation, and Verres is simply prepared to destroy it. And while Verres abandons Rome's glorious reputation, so too does he trample roughshod on any sense of justice. He arbitrarily saves his friend Cleomenes when the reckoning comes, and executes the other captains out of self-interest. As the passage says, he doesn't want them to be able to bear witness to his own ineptitude. So again, this is going to contrast with Cicero's presentation of himself as the guardian of justice on Rome's behalf. Verres is utterly negligent on that front, and Cicero will be the great sort of representative of Roman justice and legality. Well, we've seen briefly how Cleomenes abandons his men and Verres abandons justice. Cleomenes and Verres make a pretty perfect but pretty disreputable team. They both stand for the useless, corrupt aristocratic elite who needed to be held to account in Cicero's view. They both revel in a luxurious lifestyle that probably most rich Romans absolutely loved, but which didn't fit the myth of austerity that moralists like Cicero liked to peddle. So it is, I'm quite sure, if you think about what we know of Roman elite life, a joke, the idea that they didn't like luxury. They certainly did. But this is not something which must be spoken. And so presenting Verres as a luxurious figure, and Cleomenes too, is clearly intended to be a powerful weapon. As Cicero says, the praetor of the Roman people stood in his slippers, clad in a purple cloak and a tunic reaching down to his ankles, leaning on a prostitute on the shore. This is not the figure that a Roman magistrate is meant to cut. So completely useless for anything, essentially, dressed for nothing more than either bed or a party or whatever, completely impractical, clearly. The purple cloak, of course, has little resonances of kingship in it as well. And so this is, clearly intended to be a highly disreputable figure. And similarly, Cleomenes, who, as Cicero says, considered himself another Verres, not only in luxury and worthlessness, but in power also, spent like him all his days in drinking in a tent which he had pitched on the seashore. So they are, as they say, a right pair. The two of these luxurious, improperly behaved Romans who don't deserve the name. And if Cleomenes is hardly the ideal commander, meanwhile, Cicero uses really strong language to paint a picture of Verres as not only luxurious, effeminate, and extravagant, but also emotionally out of control, cruel, unjust, and greedy. Good passage for that is the one on the screen, where we're told that he advances from his Praetorian house inflamed with wickedness, frenzy, and cruelty. This is, again, these are not the virtues of the perfect governor. And he orders those unhappy and innocent men to be loaded with chains. These are the captains of the ships. The reference in the last paragraph there to impudence and audacity and avarice. Again, Cicero is really stacking up the rhetoric here to accumulate into a picture of Verres which is intolerable and indefensible. Well, since there were so many points of contact, almost certainly between Verres and probably an awful lot of the Roman elite, in spite of Verres' enormously prominent stature in the state, Cicero needs to make him seem exceptional and unique. Otherwise, he's going to end up alienating the jury, because they are, many of them, just like Verres. And so in addition to this kind of very negative characterization that we've been seeing, we also find a strong strand of argument, which is about the unprecedented nature of Verres' crimes. that, in other words, nobody else is like him. This is very, very important for Cicero's argument. Otherwise, as I say, the jury might be inclined to support Verres as a way of cloaking over their own crimes. So Verres, the ultimate criminal, comes up here. The Roman people, says Cicero, does not wish Verres to be prosecuted on obsolete accusation. It demands new charges against him. It requires something which it has not heard before. It thinks that it is not a praetor of Sicily, but some most cruel tyrant that is being brought before the court. This isolation of Verres, he's like nobody else. So, dear jurors, don't worry about being tied up with him. We're getting him on his own. He's not like you. He's much worse than anybody in this room. He's of a different quality altogether. That reference to tyranny, again, perhaps picking up on the purple cloak that he was wearing on the shore. So the idea that he's behaving in a way which takes him completely outside the framework of the normal Roman elite behavior, and would therefore allow that jury to convict him as a one-off, as somebody who's not like them. Well, Verres frames the motley crew sent out with Cleomenes and lets his friend off scot-free, as we've seen. Cicero clearly does not think much of this and evokes great sympathy for the accused. I've given you a couple of passages there which illustrate that, where he talks about these fathers whom you see here lay on the threshold. The wretched mothers spent their nights at the door of the prison, and so on. They prayed for nothing but to be allowed to receive their son's dying breath. And on he goes, oh, great and intolerable agony, terrible and bitter ill fortune, and so on. Parents were compelled to purchase not the life of their children, but a swiftness of execution for them. He goes into huge detail on the horrors meted out to the innocent victims of Verres and Cleomenes. And again, the language is just worth noting here. Even in translation, it comes across with quite some power. The exclamations, the strength of the vocabulary, and so on, rhetorically very powerful. And you can see Cicero's expertise, as I say, even in translation, his expertise as a speaker really clearly working for him. He's putting that education to good effect. And similarly, as Verres is described as reveling in the bloodbath which he creates in Sicily, this passage full of strong language, full of rhetorical questions, stressing the uniqueness of Verres, his inhumanity, his lack of concern for justice. It's all designed to make Verres seem uniquely awful and nothing at all like the jury whom Cicero wants to have on his side. If we just note a few examples there, I mean, who at that time was so cruel and hard-hearted as not to be moved by the youth of his victims, as it were? Who was there who did not weep? Who didn't feel their calamity? You rejoice and triumph at the universal misery, you Verres, that is. You're delighted that the witnesses of your avarice are put out of the way, and so on. So again, a very strong rhetorical force to alienate the jury from this monster, to present him as a cruel and unjust tyrant. Well, alongside Cicero's systematic isolation of Verres, it's again worth noting that there's another agenda going on in these speeches. As I hinted at earlier, it's not just Verres, but the whole system of the extortion courts that are under scrutiny in this case. The extortion courts, as I mentioned earlier, set up by Gaius Gracchus, made governors accountable to provincials, and also allowed equestrians to hold their superiors, the senators, to account. So, as we said earlier, these different forms of accountability in play. As I mentioned earlier, Sulla's reforms had given a senatorial monopoly to those courts, Sulla the arch-conservative, but many of Sulla's reforms would be short-lived. And this particular reform of the composition of juries in the courts was under threat of being repealed right at the time of Cicero's prosecution of VERRES. So it's a very important bit of historical background to understanding the arguments used in the prosecution of VERRES. That if we're asking how Cicero managed to slay the giant, one answer might be that a big plank in his argument was nothing to do with the facts of the case, but was playing very cleverly on the fear of the jury of senators that a wrong verdict, that is, VERRES' acquittal, would seal the fate of their stranglehold on the courts, and the proposal to bring back equestrian juries would be successful. Cicero therefore presents this case as an important test of the old system, of the senatorial system. And I think that is a really important element in understanding how Cicero frames his arguments, that it's not just about VERRES, and it's not just about VERRES' behavior and VERRES' uniquely monstrous ways, but it's also a threat really to the senatorial jury, that if they do not do the right thing and convict a clearly guilty man, if they let him off the hook, their control over the courts will be in jeopardy. And it already is in jeopardy. It's already up for discussion. So Cicero uses the fear of the jury to twist their arm, essentially, to say, look, if you get this wrong, and wrong means going against me, you will find that you no longer control these courts. And as I've given you a couple of passages there, not from the section about Cleomenes, but from the first part of the Actio Secunda, where he says, no surer means of securing our country's welfare can be devised than the assurance of the Roman people that, given the careful challenging of judges by the prosecutor, our allies, our laws, our country can be safely guarded by a court composed of senators. Okay, you watch out, senators, he says, you men of the jury, just mind what you do, because we're watching and everybody's watching. And if you don't do the right thing, you will be, your jobs will be on the line, essentially. As Cicero says a little bit later in that first part of the second hearing, the wrong conclusion means that the whole senatorial order will be despaired of by the Roman people, who will then look, he says, for some other type of man, that is the equestrians, some other method of administering justice. Okay, so you are under the scrutiny of the populus Romanus here, you men of the jury, you better get it right. So not only the whole Roman system of provincial government is under trial here, can we actually be trusted to deal properly with the provinces, or are we going to carry on just taking whatever we like with no redress? But also the very particular system of senatorial courts is under scrutiny. Cicero's very keen on the senatorial elite being in charge, very much like Sulla in many ways. But in any case here, and he's very adept at changing his line of argument when it suits him, here he uses the senatorial elite very cleverly to make convicting VERRES essential to the jury's own self-interests. So although, you know, he himself would clearly like the senators to stay in charge because he always wants the senators to be in charge, in fact, here he twists that around a little bit to put pressure on the jury to convict his opponent. So various winning strategies for Cicero: isolating VERRES from an equally corrupt jury, presenting VERRES as exceptionally and perhaps even uniquely cruel, and noting the importance for survival of the senatorial jury of securing the right result, that is, VERRES' conviction. Finally then, transforming Cicero into a giant. Well, VERRES and Hortensius, as Cicero says, with all the wealth and all the energy of the mightiest in the land, are pitted against poor little Cicero. And again, that's somewhat the same argument as he uses in the Proroscio, poor little me, and what do I know? But of course, he's going to deliver some pretty resounding successes on the back of that self-presentation. The combative nature of forensic rhetoric means that this trial, as all trials, is going to be a battle of personalities. But Cicero and Hortensius are going to turn out to be allies in the trial of Murena only a few years later. Cicero, by that point in his consular year, is very much a Goliath. He has risen to the status of not being poor little Cicero anymore, but being the absolutely biggest hitter on the rhetorical and forensic stage. And in a sense, it's these early cases, the proroscio, and in particular the in verrem, which allows him to transform himself in that way. He twists his arguments in any direction that will suit him on the occasion, for the occasion. As in political life and any period of history, there's no such thing as principle with Cicero. He claims that he represents the same views all the way through his career. He claims to be the great constant in all of this, but in fact, it's very clear that he will twist and turn in any direction to suit his argument on the day. But above all, the message has to be that education and the capacity to deliver these terrifying blows to two enormous giants of the day, VERRES and Hortensius, his barrister, cements Cicero's path towards future success. And as I said earlier, his decision to publish, of course, he didn't necessarily publish everything that he, all the speeches that he gave, but his choice to come up with an absolutely enormous publication of the Verrine material suggests that he saw that as a huge cornerstone, really, in cementing his success. So I'm going to stop there. I hope I've talked for roughly the right amount of time, and throw open the floor if that was what you normally do at this point.
Comment first, Andy, please.
Yes, please do, Nigel.
Excuse me, my damn phone's going. I'll have to cope with the phone. Ask someone else first.
In that case, Angela, I think, has raised her virtual hand, so I'll ask Angela to ask a question.
Okay. Thanks very much for that very interesting talk. I was one of the people at the readings, and one thing that struck me when we were reading through this was the language and how it seemed to be quite biased, that on first take, as it were. So what I wanted to ask you was, how far was this a prosecution or a persecution with an agenda? Because that's quite important. And also, would the defendant's legal people, were their transcripts, are they available, or it's just that they haven't been published, but they are available, or they just disappeared?
So we only ever get Cicero's side of these things. Occasionally it's possible in some speeches to kind of reconstruct a little bit of what some of the other side's arguments must have been, because Cicero is directly countering them. So he'll sort of say, oh, you say in your speech that, and well, I can tell you otherwise, sort of thing. But no, we don't have published versions of other people's contributions to these trials. So it is it's one of the great difficulties of late Republican history, that it's so much viewed through the eyes of one individual who simply tells us how to think. And the only check I can think of on that really is to suggest that if his arguments were utterly implausible or lacked conviction, that actually he would not be winning these cases. So there has to be, whatever he says, of course, as you rightly say, the language is very elevated. The language is pretty much that of persecution rather than prosecution. But the fact is that he has to persuade a jury. And if his account is completely untenable, one has to assume that the jury wouldn't have gone with him. Or in this case, of course, we don't really ever get a proper conviction because VERRES is frightened off the stage. That presumably must tell us that either Cicero's arguments were incredibly persuasive, or at very least the stack of evidence which he claims to have ready to roll, as it were, is enough to persuade Verres that it would be better not to hang around.
Okay. Yes, thank you.
I think there was one reference, wasn't there, in the passage that we read last week to something that Hortensius had said on the first day, which if it was in the first day, he must actually have said, even though
Yes.
Cicero never needed to rebut it because Verres had run away.
Yes, yes, yeah.
But is that a kind of a definite signal of guilt? I mean, I'm sure he wasn't perfect, but you know, the fact that it is so one-sided.
Well, I suppose one might consider that, you know, Verres had the leading lawyer of the day at his side. And, you know, Cicero is going to take that crown, as it were, largely because of cases like this. But at the time, Hortensius, you can't do better than Hortensius if you want a good barrister. And so one has to assume that Hortensius was making the best possible case for Verres. And that if Verres felt that actually his case was lost, or it was better to leave Rome, that must suggest that actually, you know, he really was defeated. You know, there was nothing more that could be said.
Mm-hmm. But was this a test case, or were there other cases?
There are cases all the time for you know, mismanagement of provinces and corruption within Rome and electioneering and so on and so forth. I'd venture to suggest that although, of course, we're very much dependent on just whatever we have from Cicero, so we don't really, we know the names of other orators and so on, but we can't read what they wrote or reconstruct that. But nevertheless, it does strike me that certainly, unless Cicero's completely having us on, that this is a very high level trial and atypically high profile. And, you know, insofar as it's brought onto the stage such big figures, and is enough to really, you know, change Cicero's fortunes in terms of his own career.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
May I say something first? I thought your talk was beautifully prepared and really well delivered, and you did us all a favour. Thank you very much for coming to us. Now then, I've recently been reading the Lampsacus episode in the VERRES, and also an article by Katherine Steele, which seeks, I'm sure you know all about it, which seeks to say that Cicero's facts are few and far between, and the case, if I may say, is accusing Verres of being a creature of unbridled lust before he ever went to Sicily, nothing to do with Sicily. And he just tries to blacken him, and the jury could not have known whether what Cicero alleges was true or not.
No.
It's just character assassination, according to Katherine Steele, anyway.
Yes.
And it's quite pervasive, isn't it? Persuasive, rather.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And if only we could have Cicero orating in front of us, we'd know why he won. He must have been such an imposing figure. Yeah. How the hell, you know, he didn't have to be all that much of a lawyer, did he? He had to be an advocate.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's thank you for your very kind words. That's very generous of you. But I mean, in terms of the sort of the balance between content and rhetoric, as it were, I mean, there is, you know, notoriously little discussion of the case in many of Cicero's speeches.
Absolutely.
Partly, I suppose, because there's no forensic evidence, and you know, what is essentially it's a trial depending on probability and character. You know, this is my client. He's a good man. I'm a good man. You all know me because I'm Cicero, and you know from ages ago that I've been a good man. I wouldn't be defending somebody who wasn't also a good man. And that's the argument, really. And therefore, he must be innocent. And there's no kind of substance to it. But it's just, as you say, the strength of the rhetoric, the flimsy nature of the content, actually, but somehow, bolstered by little details which are designed, I think, so often little historical examples and so on, which are designed not necessarily to be particularly relevant, but perhaps to flatter the audience into oh, I've heard of that, so, they're on his side because he's made them feel clever for a moment, that actually they've heard of that too. And then he starts to work with that and can take them wherever he wants. So I think there are all kinds of little tricks and tactics for Cicero to not to need to deal with the case, really, but rather, just to kind of, and I think that increases as his career goes on, so that in his later forensic speeches, he's more and more really just talking about himself. I mean, it's kind of irrelevant who the client is, because the argument is about the fact that Cicero always wins, and therefore, so of course he'll win again.
It's a bit similar to the centuries-old system of compurgation. I don't know whether you're familiar with all this, but all he had to do is find a certain number of people to come to court and say he's a good lad.
Yes.
And if they did, you got off. Never mind about the facts.
Yes, yeah. And I think that that's particularly true in the Roman legal system, where, as I mentioned earlier, your legal career is interwoven with your political career. They're one and the same. And therefore, it's not just your legal cases that you've won, which you can stack up and list on your CV, as it were, but also all that you've done for the res publica as a magistrate, as a consul. And so that, Cicero, once he's had his consulship, will feed that into every speech he makes. Just remember when I saved the state as consul against Catiline. He's still doing it 20 years after. So that it's an accumulative effect whereby his status as the lead, as he defines himself, the lead politician, the lead defender of the Republic, the person who embodies the laws, and best understands them, and can take you, his audience, through that world as your guide, as your authoritative guide, and will tell you what to think about it. That's how it works. So that actually the nuts and bolts of the case are very trivial.
Absolutely, yeah.
And on this question of, do you need to be a great lawyer or just a great advocate? If we fast forward 2,000 years to the early years of the 20th century, of course, the newspapers were full of these celebrity casees like Marshall Hall and Patrick Hastings, who you just seemed to need to hire one of them unless they were opposing each other, and you'd either get off or you'd manage to convict the person that you were against, which is a similar sort of thing, really.
Yeah, that's why I said at the beginning that we think that we've sort of moved on to an evidence-based legal system, but actually there's still ever such a lot of this personality stuff. Yeah.
Could I ask you, Katherine, about Cicero and sincerity? This is, perhaps a dangerous path to tread. But the interesting thing about his early career is he takes on what we might call sort of hardcore optimates, but winds up on their side. I mean, you could see at the end of Cicero's career, he would actually be defending VERRES rather than attacking VERRES. Do you think that we can trace any degree of consistency? I mean, is he an aristo, but an aristo with a conscience, one might say? Or is it in fact that the key that there are these opportunities to make a name for oneself? I personally tend to feel that the tragedy of Cicero is he wants to get into the charmed circle. He never really gets into the charmed circle. Is this, a man who really must have died in a very frustrated form, that, he never quite made where he wanted to go?
Yeah. Well, that's a very good question, isn't it? I mean, I suspect that I think he just died frustrated, but I think he dies frustrated because he cannot change, and therefore he holds to the end of his career to a view of the Republic which probably, well, certainly wasn't really existent during his lifetime, and certainly couldn't be sustainable by the mid first century in any shape or form, because external factors had made that untenable, made that impossible. So I think actually, I suspect that he was frustrated when he died, simply because he couldn't adapt his notion of the res publica to the new circumstances, and just kept harping on with the same thing over and over again. But I agree with you. I mean, I think he never, well, he makes it in his own view, because his consulship is, as he says in the Fourth Catilinarian, to be seen as synonymous with the Republic. Think me, think Republic. You can't get better than that for Cicero. But at the same time, if you think about his career in the 50s, he's very much the tool of the triumvirs and the dynasts. He's very much at their bidding. He's being pushed to take on cases which he really, which don't chime at all with what he says he believes in. And and even before that, you talked about sincerity. I mean, think about the Pro Morena, which is again a kind of, it's a trial about integrity. During Cicero's consulship, he wants to defend Morena because, as he says, it's more important for the interests of the res publica that Morena be acquitted and be able to be consul in 62 than allow Catiline in. So he argues a kind of silly case on those grounds, but actually he's defending somebody on the kinds of charges which he would naturally be prosecuting. So, the interests of the moment do seem to me to kind of override any consistency there. And furthermore, in that case, in order to get the jury to acquit Morena, he has to make an argument which says essentially, the most important kind of consul is the military consul, Morena. Oh, whoops, here I am, I'm consul. I've never picked up a sword in my life, So actually, no, he says, not just the military consul. There are two very good types of consul: the military consul, that's Morena, and the orator consul, that's me. So, it's a quick, nifty bit of footwork to get out of that corner. So I think he's clever. He's thinking on his feet. He's thinking about how to kind of twist and turn so that he gets where he wants to be. But if you really scrutinize for consistency, well, he is, as I put on my final slide, he's more of a chameleon than that. His skill really is in being able to speak to the moment. Again, sits oddly with the idea that he can't seem to change his political views, but maybe those are two separate things.
Oh, thanks very much. I used to say to students that Cicero was the David Owen of his time, a man who thought he was more important than he was. But of course, I've proved myself there, because now nobody knows who David Owen is, and therefore this is a completely futile point to make.
I mean, Cicero is surely the best self-publicist in history. I mean, he actually, especially by making sure that nobody else's speeches survive. I mean, he's been given a golden ticket, really, hasn't he? And we spend the whole time, and certainly with my students, I spent the whole time basically debunking Cicero's myth of himself, and trying to persuade them that actually, we need to be a bit skeptical about this. But
can I ask you a very different tack about Quintilian and his view of Cicero? Did he think Cicero was a really good thing 100 years later and more?
Well, that's a good question, isn't it? Yeah, I think he's got time for Cicero, but then, time for Cicero sounds a bit derogatory. I mean, yes, but equally, what's quite interesting actually about the rhetorical works like Quintilian, but also actually Cicero's own rhetorical works, is that you do begin to get a sense that, in fact, in spite of what we've said, there's more than just Cicero on the scene. And so, I mean, Cicero himself talks obviously about the other orators and what he thinks of them, including, you know, people who stand up against him in court, but he still respects them. And so when you come to later rhetoricians like Quintilian, there again, you perhaps, it's an interesting question actually, because it broadens it out from what we've been saying, doesn't it? To the fact that there is actually a scene here as opposed to just an individual.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for mentioning that. That's a very important aspect.
Angela, did you have you put your hand up again? If so, please fire away with the second question.
Okay, so just quickly, I wanted to ask. I mean, there is a bigger picture here, which you did mention at the beginning, whereas it is the people versus the hierarchy. But you know, the people are this amorphous mass, and this is one individual. So I guess what I would have liked to have heard would have been their evidence. Would it have stood up to scrutiny?
Yes, of what the people thought, you mean, of
what their evidence was, or you know, whoever was brought to give evidence against. I think that would have been very important.
Oh yes, or you mean the evidence of the Sicilians against Verres?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Well, that's an interesting question again, isn't it? Because we've only got Cicero's word for it that he's got a cellar full of, you know, boxes.
Straining at the leash.
And some of the captains are dead, of course.
Yes, exactly. Yes. That's an interesting question. I mean, again, I suppose one might say that if Verres' legal team is up to anything, and we know that they, you know, that he couldn't have bought a better legal team in that time, that presumably they would have been onto it if actually this evidence was just sort of fake and didn't really exist or wouldn't stand up to scrutiny. But we never get a chance to find that out. So yeah, it's a very interesting question. We just have Cicero's word that he was assured by everybody in Sicily pretty much that that Verres had been a monster.
Sure.
If I could raise another old chestnut, Katherine, if I may. I mean, how far do you think what we have is what Cicero would have delivered in court? And that would be true of his other forensic speeches, which he did deliver in court as well.
Yeah.
Is there a substantial gap, in your opinion, between the written publication and, perhaps if I may just a second question, who read these things?
Yeah.
And what was delivered in court?
Yeah. So who read them, we don't know, do we really? But presumably Cicero thinks there's a readership there for whom it's worth publishing, because of the way in which he publishes strategically at key moments in his career. So that suggests to me that he's expecting these publications to have an impact on helping him out of difficult situations and so on. Who exactly that was, it's not quite clear, but presumably he's expecting people of influence to be reminded of his performances by the publications. In terms of the gap between what was said and what was written, again, we don't know, but I suppose, you know, as ever, arguments from plausibility come into play. You know, he has to presumably be able to assume that somebody might have actually been present who later read a published version. And I suppose if there were a huge and, you know, unbridgeable gulf between the one and the other, his credibility would have been at stake. But I think it's equally highly likely that tweaks were made to particularly, you know, some speeches where it seems fairly clear that he's benefiting from a bit of hindsight in terms of anticipating problems that arise later and so on, and that it's, you know, more than likely that he's fed that bit of hindsight back into what he claims to be the delivered version when he publishes. Again, the Catilinarians are quite easy pickings for this. He, you know, it claims in the fourth Catilinarian speech that people might think he's a cruel tyrant. Well, yes, they might, if you then, you know, take it further and see what happened after his consulship. But, you know, but he doesn't publish those speeches for another 3 years. So it's an easy opportunity to kind of make himself look clever, have anticipated criticism which came later. We've no evidence that he actually did anticipate that at the time. And when he's riding on a crest of, his consular sort of authority. So I think, I'm sorry, it's a rather unsatisfactory answer, but I think that for me, there are probably parameters between which the adjustments would have to be made. Highly unlikely that it's verbatim what he said, but also highly unlikely that it's grotesquely distorted.
Oh, thanks very much. I don't think that's unfair at all. I mean, if anything, the question's unfair because, I mean, we are actually talking about an unknown quantity, aren't we, at the end of the day?
Well, we don't know, yes. Yeah.
Yes, I think I was going to ask the same sort of question, really, about, because you mentioned something about him talking about different consuls and then like picking himself up. So most of this must have been written down before he stood up to speak, presumably.
That's a very good question, isn't it? I wonder.
And then afterwards, yes, I don't know. Carry on.
Yeah. I mean, who knows? It's hard to imagine that somebody would just be able to stand up and speak at that length without some kind of script. On the other hand, of course, we know that people are actually capable of amazing feats of memory, and of and also just of eloquentia. Just this capacity to speak fluently and coherently without a script. And just put it together. It seems unlikely that it was, that he could have done that, as I say, for such long periods of time without sort of losing the thread or whatever. But or without, and that there's, in spite of what we said about lack of detail, of course, there are these kind of specific little bits of detail which he puts in. I mean, did he have little notes to tell him about that? But it's difficult to say, because actually, if you think about what we know of ancient oratory in terms, Quintilian, what Quintilian tells us about, not just the words, but about the performance and about the gesticulation and about, that actually walking around with a script wouldn't have lent itself particularly well to that whole world of, essentially putting on a dramatic presentation. So, I'll keep an open mind actually on whether he actually really had scripted this out fully beforehand.
Nero had someone taking notes. Sorry, Andrew. Sorry.
No. So Nero gets a bum rap for speaking from notes. Although I mean, that part of it is because Seneca has written the speech for him, and this is regarded as very bad form indeed.
Yeah.
So arguably, there is, and I agree with Katherine. I mean, some people can do this. We're told Queen Elizabeth I could do this, and indeed do it in Latin, for heaven's sake.
Yes.
So that may have been part of Cicero's appeal at one level. That he's the real deal because he doesn't speak from notes and all the rest of it. I mean, just actually one thing, which is a very trivial thing, but I mean, when I first got on the council, it was regarded as remarkably bad form to speak to the council from notes.
Yeah.
And that clearly marked you out as a second division councillor. Yeah. So these things are floating around still, I think, in various shapes and forms. I mean, that of course would be on the day, wouldn't it? So I mean, again, the published version has a very different resonance. But perhaps the performance in court, and I agree with you, Katherine, that wandering around with a scroll, and it would have been a most unwieldy thing, wouldn't it? I mean, if we think about the mechanics of writing at that time, it would have looked fairly awful, and I think it would have got in the way of some of the histrionics and the gestures and all the rest of it.
Yes, yeah, I think so. And as you say, there are still contexts where actually you'd really be, not given much credibility if you had to read what obviously not enormously long speeches on the whole nowadays, but not being able to speak extempore in a fairly fluent and coherent way, as I say, would I think even now be seen as a bit of a failing. So in certain contexts, so yeah, I think let's give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he could just say it.
May I suggest a name to you, which is Brian Walden? You've got to be of a certain age to know Brian. He was at university with me. And Brian could speak extempore on the telly live for half an hour without a note. So it isn't just Cicero who could do it.
No. Yeah. Well, there's a challenge for us all.
You take it up.
But now, of course, the politicians stand up and they've got these sort of see-through teleprompter things because they don't dare put a word wrong. You know, it's got to be as sort of worked over and written for them.
Yeah.
But
sorry.
Even in the way you said that, Sadie, I mean, there's an implication there that this is a poor politician. Yep. So maybe that again comes back to Cicero, and maybe he just had the gift of the gab, as we used to say, and that can be a very, very important thing in politics.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was reading some Horace today, which perhaps makes me very sad. I don't know, but I mean, part of it was about disliking Persian trappings. And again, when you were talking, Katherine, I mean, when the way VERRES is described sort of comes over in a way as Oriental despot. Do you think that was deliberately part of the rhetoric, that there's a sort of reference back to the classical Greek past here for the learned audience?
Yes, I think I'm sure that there's an element of sort of, Eastern luxury tied up with Oriental despotism coming in there. And of course, that's going to be rhetoric against Antony as well in the Philippics, and was, I think, probably quite it's quite a complicated, I think, strand of thought in the late Republic. I mean, if you think about even Tiberius Gracchus being presented with a diadem and a purple cloak by the envoys from Pergamum, and that I don't think was meant to be sort of marking him out as a tyrant, although it could be read negatively in that way. It's probably more likely that, if you come from Pergamum, that's what you would give to somebody, because you're used to that world of Hellenistic kingdoms. But so I think it's a complicated rhetorical trope insofar as we take it automatically as a sort of Persian king negative element, and it's probably a little bit more subtle than that, but nevertheless, in Cicero's hands, I think it's clearly designed to be worrying the audience in terms of what's happened to Cato the Elder and boiling turnips outside your hut kind of thing, because that's what humans did. That's the world that we live in, and that's why Rome was great. And so, the idea of somebody flouncing around in a purple cloak and slippers is just not okay. And as I say, it's going to be rolled out again against Antony. Just
this is now me thinking as we're going along, but I mean, I just wonder whether there actually Cicero could be sneakily going in for a cultural misunderstanding, that in Greek Sicily, this sort of thing was pretty okay by and large, but the trial isn't there. It's in a different social context, and therefore trailing that stuff out, which might have been entirely innocent, in fact, more than entirely innocent in Sicily, starts to look odious in the extreme.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I think that's quite likely, actually, that he's sort of making mileage out of, as you say, a sort of a cultural dissonance there. But actually, he can, as we've said, he can play anything to his advantage. And there he is, busy in front of a senatorial jury in Rome, threatening the jury that they're going to lose control of the courts if they behave in an un-Roman or improper way. Anything which kind of aligns his opponent with luxury, foreignness. As I said, the point about Cleomenes being a Syracusan, you should have a Roman in charge of this, not a Syracusan. Well, Sicily's not that far away, really. I mean, come on. But he'll play anything to maximise the rhetorical effect. So I think that's a very interesting idea, that actually sort of the fact that the trial is taking place in Rome allows him to make that point in a way which probably wouldn't have worked had it been in Syracuse.
As they say at the football ground, it's all gone quiet over there. Have we got any more questions for Katherine this evening? I think we've had a very good discussion, but I mean, if there's any more to be had, I don't wish to close things down. In that case, I know Katherine has matters to attend to, so perhaps what we should do is we can't really thank her in the traditional way. What we can do, of course, is thank her in the reactions way, can't we, by sort of doing something like that.
So those of us
I would like to thank you very much indeed for a splendid talk, as Nigel says, and I entirely concur with what he said, and also for, I think that the quality of the talk has been brought out by the lengthy discussion about these things, and we can all go away and read a little bit more Cicero perhaps, and think a little bit more about him. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation and also for the really lively discussion. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.